Welcome to Áras an Uachtaráin, the venue for the first of 3 seminars inaugurated by Uachtaráin na hÉireann President of Ireland Michael D. Higgins. Machnamh is an Irish word encompassing consideration, meditation, thought and reflection. Machnamh 100 is an invitation from the President, Michael D. Higgins, for us all to join him in reflecting on the pivotal events of 100 years ago on this island and further afield. What led to them, what they led to, and how they continue to resonate with us today. This is the first in a series of seminars that over the next 12 months will consider the War of Independence, the Civil War, and partition. Throughout the series, scholars with different perspectives and areas of expertise will share their thoughts. President Higgins is particularly keen to provide an opportunity for us to dwell on those aspects of our shared past that have perhaps been given less attention, or where consideration might help us to gain a fuller understanding of the motivations, opportunities, and constraints faced by those who lived a century ago. History has always been a contested and emotive subject, not least between different traditions on this island, and also between Ireland and Britain. It can sometimes be weaponized or proffered as a justification for contemporary action or inaction. A central motivation of the President in bringing us this series is to provide a space where we might, through a deeper understanding and appreciation of our history and shared past, free ourselves from its capacity to inhibit our consideration of options for today and for our future together. In this opening seminar, we are bringing you the first of these reflections, which will focus on commemoration itself, what we commemorate, why we do it, and in some cases, why we may fail to commemorate. We're coming to you from Áras an Uachtaráin, the home of every Irish president since 1938, and during the programme you will notice the portraits of each of President Higgins' predecessors, which hang in this state dining room. It is also apt to remember that a century ago this was home to the Lord Lieutenant, the highest-ranking British official in Ireland and representative of the British monarch. The President will start today's proceedings with his reflections on commemorations, and his paper will be responded to in turn by Professor Kieran Benson, Professor Anne Dolan, Professor Michael Laffin, and Professor Joep Leersen, who will be joining us by link from Holland. We will then have a panel discussion with questions prompted by some of those originally invited to be present, but who, because of COVID restrictions, could not be with us in person. We have circulated the papers to them in advance of this webcast. We will hear their questions presently. May I now invite Uachtaráin na hÉireann, President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, to address us with his opening paper, Of Centenaries and the Hospitality Necessary in Reflecting on Memory, History and Forgiveness.
The decades through which we are living have been referred to as decades of centenaries. It is inevitable that some centenaries be emphasized more than others, thus creating a challenge of understanding as to how memory, history, and symbolism have been used or invoked to suggest difference, distance from the other, as it were. The act of commemoration, I believe, need not, indeed should not, add to that distance from the other. Indeed, I believe that approached with a sophistication as to the uses of memory and recall, and a willingness to share the discipline of evidence-based historiography, it is possible to transcend such distance as was engendered, amplified, and is being sustained between communities on this island and with our nearest neighbour, of whose empire we were a part just over a century ago. We are in new times, and in a shared context of struggling to defeat a virus that has taken the lives of citizens without discrimination as to any boundaries between us. I want to suggest that we should take the opportunity of transacting, that is to say, confronting and working through that which establishes the distance between us in terms of different narratives of violence as recalled, the absolutisms that drove those impulses to violence, the careless and dangerous assumptions of the other which may have driven such violence. In previous considerations of public memory, I have suggested that amnesia as to painful events of the past is not an option. I was drawing inter alia on the work of Hannah Arendt, Paul Ricoeur, and Richard Kearney to indicate the necessity of coming to terms with recalled outrage, the essential ethical foundations of the appropriateness of memory, and the practical use of such procedures as would enable, to use Kearney's phrase, a hospitality of narratives. That is to say, an openness to different narratives of the historical experience. It may be difficult to personally experience the recall of the different forms that the sources of violence took, but there is a real gain in reflecting on and confronting the assumptions as to how and why there was recourse to violence, the further development and infliction of new forms of violence. What purpose was sought or served by these sources, proximate or ancient? What is at stake in making the reflection I suggest is not the offering of a set of competing rationalizations of opposing violences, but rather a recovery of contexts that need to be understood, whatever purposes may have been served by such rationalizations. Such recovered context must include, in addition to a consideration of violence, adequate recognition of the efforts of those who sought peace in the face of emerging conflicts. They include the trade union movement north and south, pacifists, feminists, individual clerics such as Archbishop Clune of Perth. Their presence in the historiography tends to be understated. Violence and recall of it dominate. Yet peace matters. It is possible, for example, to see 1920 as a year of the lost opportunity for a peaceful transition, a loss that emerged from a series of opportunities not taken in the immediate years preceding. It is necessary too, however uncomfortable, to hear the views of those who believe that, even with all the tragedy that emerged, perhaps a greater loss of life was avoided by the making of compromises and new accommodations, later to be the subject of contestation, even rejection. Even more important is the need to recognize that what was perceived by some, for example, as a loss of empire, was for others, such as nationalists, a moment of emancipation, of a freedom long delayed and based to unremembered, deeply layered humiliation, loss of respect, an indomitable search for independence, the pursuit of which was a value inherited and an aspiration for freedom recovered from past failures, and the expression of a diverse but indomitable people. That aspiration, of course, accommodated within it different versions of freedom. The result of excluded narratives or perspectives led for too long to the domination of a sealed as opposed to an open version of history. An evasive forgetting, too, was as important as remembering in this selective approach, for both remembering and forgetting are utilized in the case of collective memories that generate exclusive narratives of the other. Paul Ricoeur refers to this in his suggestion of the tendency of such an abuse of memory to be justified as loyalty or faithfulness, an approach from which history, in the pursuit of fact, has to distance itself. This indeed might suggest that there may be an unavoidable tension between history and memory. History is important as an evidence-based framework for what public remembering we choose to do. We are fortunate on this island, I believe, in having sharply relevant new contributions from historians drawing on newly available sources, new considerations of context, scholars who are addressing neglected themes, others revising or deepening previous scholarship. Undertaking responsibility for the building of a capacity for achieving a hospitality of narratives is a task for us all. I particularly want to commend the work in this regard here in Ireland of Johnston McMaster and his colleague Cathy Higgins and others, who are giving such a lead in developing cross-community courses in ethical remembering, which run a timeline of historical events as a background to the contested contexts of differing public memories. I believe great results can flow from such engagement. If I may quote from a recent paper of Johnston McMaster on this topic, history requires ethical analysis, which in turn requires appropriate attention to context. Attention to context means that we cannot read history uncritically from the contemporary standpoint or current ethical perspectives. The perceived wisdom of the time needs to be engaged. As we set about the task of ethical remembering, it may be useful to ask, why do we commemorate? For whom do we commemorate? And why has it become such an important ritual over the centuries? Heather Jones, in her contribution to the superb Atlas of the Irish Revolution, asserts, there have been complex historiographical debates about the nature of collective memory and war remembrance, but the term commemoration has been less clearly analysed. John Horne argues that the practices of commemoration have their own history, which is that of traces left behind by the episodes that caused them and the changing awareness over time of their importance. In his book Commemoration, historian Seth C. Brugman calls commemoration the lingua franca of public memory, encompassing the various ways we have imagined in monuments, ceremonies, festivals, pageants, fairs, museums, reenactments, to register deep regard for the past by those in the present. Unlike history, which is concerned primarily with circumstance, commemoration dwells predominantly in feeling. It could be argued, as Brueggemann does, that the diversity of rituals, objects, and customs that we associate with commemoration are all intended to give public feeling to what are otherwise often private memories. Commemoration, therefore, offers the opportunity to reflect, to look deeply at change over time, to provide an understanding of where things have been, where they are today, and why. The idea of commemoration is always correctly rooted in agency and the intent to accord importance to an aspect of the past. It is therefore an active concept encompassing social and cultural functions and serving, for example, as a bonding tool for enhanced social capital, employed for pedagogical purposes to spread awareness of historical events, and for some, acting as a form of retributive justice to honor those perceived to have been the victims. Commemoration brings to the fore a consideration of how the study of the past and our collective memory may be valuable to individuals, communities, and a wider society. Through commemoration, history helps create and nurture active, engaged citizens. I want to suggest that we should use the present context of the shared experience of struggles with the COVID-19 virus to be radical in our acknowledgement of what we have excluded, and that there is value in seeking to work towards an ethical task together, one of inclusion and respect, one that brings us beyond, relieves us the burden of sectarian tendencies, past and present. In this decade of significant commemoration, we continue to be challenged to engage with our shared past in a way that is honest, authentic, and pluralistic. The complex events we recall and commemorate during this decade are integral to the story that has shaped our nation in all its diversity, at home and abroad. They are, however, events to be remembered that will be retold from many different standpoints, and it is through respecting these different perspectives in all their complexity that we can facilitate a more authentic construction, not only of our intersecting shared history, but of our post-sectarian possibilities for the future. While memory can be both constructive and reconstructive, that is to say, it is developed over time, built upon by age-old acquisition of the distant senses, imagination, and thought, yet central to the concept of ethical remembering must be the notion of authenticity. This in turn is nuanced by what Professor Kieran Benson describes as the ever-present warning that remembering, whether individual or collective, is always shadowed by uncertainty, and from a responsible moral perspective ought to be accompanied by a knowledge of that possibility. The act of remembering invites, of course, risk of an emotional kind, even if executed in private. If executed publicly as commemorations, it has a wider impact. If the commemoration is to be hospitable to multiple narratives, to a plurality of interpretations, ground has to be given from earlier, even comforting, foundational myths upon which one's own personality and communal shared beliefs have relied. It seems to me useful to reflect on the purpose of the act of remembering as one prepares to issue an invitation to what is an increasingly diverse public to engage in the more public act of commemoration. Issues of the fullness of context in its being taken into account or being excluded cannot morally be avoided. For example, when during our memorial services for the dead in the two wars of the 20th century we state, "We shall remember them from the break of day to the setting of the sun." Are we celebrating their lived and lost lives together in the conditions of war as fellow vulnerable human beings? Or are we allowed also to see them as the human carnage of conflict, of a clash of imperial aspirations? What is the intention guiding our invocation? To fail to remember is to kill the victims twice, Paul Ricoeur has written. Yes, it is undeniable that in the intimacy of trenches under terrible bombardment, some of the greatest extensions of human courage, compassion, and bravery have been delivered, but at a terrible cost. Acknowledging the context of what we recognize as the heroic should not be a problem. Who could not be moved by the inscription on a tombstone? But then, if we are to have an authentic act of public memory, should we not be moved in an ever deeper way at what a field of graves tells us of the failure that the slaughter of war has represented, not only in the 20th century, but in all centuries? An ethical act of memory has to be a critical act of memory. I suggest there should be an engagement with the issues of context before the act of public memory is transformed to commemoration in any narrow sense. Commemoration is not only a public invitation, it is an act predicated on selection. The act of selection is challenging and poses choices as to what is appropriate or even a temporary excursion into collective memory. Such choices can never be neutral, nor is there any way they can be claimed to be objective. Thus, assumptions that guided inclusion and exclusion are best stated. What can be achieved, I believe, is a transparency of purpose, an honesty of endeavour in keeping open the possibility of plural interpretations and future revision based on new facts or original analysis. This is put very well in relation to 1916 in Ethics and the Easter Rising Again by Johnston McMaster and Cathy Higgins, where they write, "Remembering ethically is not just about remembering inclusively, honouring all the dead in the mystery of their humanness. It is about taking responsibility ourselves for the present and the future. We cannot afford to be controlled or dictated to from the grave, but as human beings take responsibility ourselves for our own distinctive time, place, and world." Thus the challenge is, for example, to take the piece that we have put on paper in the agreement we achieved over 2 decades ago and use it to achieve peace in communities. A peace that will make dividing walls redundant, allow our children to share schools, read history with respect for difference, and moving through such a shared respect, achieve the ability for a shared fulfillment together in the future, encountering on the way such understanding as is necessary and such forgiveness as is made possible. Commemoration itself can therefore be an important aspect of ethical remembering. However, discretion is required with regard to how we mark important historical events, particularly those that may be exploited for narrow political or partisan purposes. Indeed, some historians have rightly warned us against the perils posed to historical truth by any backward imputation of motives, any uncritical transfer of contemporary emotions onto the past. Time and again, we have seen how history can be used and abused for insidious, morally dubious purposes. As historian Roisin Higgins puts it, the fractious nature of the revolutionary period has created many possibilities for commemorative events as well as a great deal of potential for division. That is not to say that we should censor memory of painful events. To do so would be, at best, I suggest, amoral. For example, during the War of Independence, the acts of aggression unleashed by Crown forces and administered by the Black and Tans and auxiliaries in particular were often in the form of exemplary collective punishments and reprisals. Such horrors would be contrary to the modern-day Geneva Conventions and would be considered illegal under international law. Being as they were an escalation of state-approved violence, these acts became the mark of a policy and strategy of holding control. They were aimed at subjugation, installation of fear in a public that had in its midst those that sought and were fighting for independence. There is little doubt that the infliction of economic damage by both the auxiliaries and Black and Tans was not merely a spontaneous series of acts by the uncontrolled or the drunken. Rather, it was a key strategic tool, a responsive empire employed in an attempt to quash support for any separatism that constituted a threat to that empire. The move by the British forces towards attacks on business and cooperatives, including rural creameries, which were major employers and sources of essential foodstuffs, marked an escalation in both the wider socioeconomic impacts and the sophistication of reprisal tactics, harming local economies and livelihoods by punishing the civilian population through the destruction of a cherished public utility or key employer. Reprisals and collective punishments were a key aspect of empire rule by the different forms of empire that were increasingly coming under opposition from below. Empire was challenged, along with its imposition of colonial power, laws, attributes, and ideologies. Such violent tactics were already an established strategic tool of imperialist military strategy by the time they occurred in Ireland during the War of Independence. Such acts and anticipation of them drew a violent response in turn from a repertoire of responses, be it in relation to land, language, or poverty. Responses and innovations, too, that were available to Irish nationalists, motivated by both new and recalled humiliations, of which there was no shortage. The changed nature of the RIC, it having been augmented by a newly arrived force, some inexperienced in terms of discipline and recently discharged, perhaps unemployed soldiers, others, officers, ideologically driven, meant that its Irish-born members of the RIC were now at risk of being constituted as part of the enemy forces. Those, and there were many, who may have joined the RIC for security of job and pension, or for housing or educational opportunities for their children, who were embedded in a community in previous times, were now in changed circumstances, targets, and the killing of them was often the instigation of forays from barracks by the new forces, burnings, exemplary collective punishments, and further tragic loss of life. Of course, the British forces were not alone when it came to reprisals and atrocities. Violence breeds violence. Cruelty is learned, and indeed the history of Irish republicanism is one in which the callous disregard for human life has been displayed on too many occasions, with civilians often constituting the target in what is often termed the Irish struggle. War is always ugly, and posthumous glorification is neither desirable nor morally sound. We must, therefore, I believe, seek to enable all our citizens to engage with history and commemoration in a way that is inclusive, ethical, pluralist, and honest, allowing for the evaluation of motives and of actions on all sides with fairness. In terms of inclusivity, we have at times fallen short in our duty of public remembering in some significant areas of our shared history. For example, in Ireland, the state's channeling of grief for those who died during World War I, or those who died and suffered in the succeeding conflicts of the War of Independence and the Civil War. Indeed, on occasion, in the later 1920s, for example, the state could be accused of being partisan and exclusive and thus divisive. Such an approach to official remembering, in which the state was often absent or selective, resulted in additional grief for many relatives of those who died in the struggle for Irish independence, owing to the sense that they had not received due recognition for their loss. This adds weight to the argument for state commemoration for all of those who lost their lives in the fight for Irish independence, even as a palliative measure that might aid personal grief. Recalling frailty, error, or weakness is more difficult, it seems, for much of historiography. Speaking of strength in the pursuit of hegemony of narrative seems easier. Yet to achieve a capacity for peace or fulfillment, we need a recognition of weakness as well as of strength, of error and failure as well as of certainties vindicated. Arriving at such a narrative hospitality, to quote Paul Ricoeur, such as I suggest, requires generous effort, and reaching an accommodation with conflicting versions of the past is merely a stage in the journey via understanding to what might be the destination that is forgiveness for past hurt, neglect, or omission. A destination which in so many areas of conflict at home and abroad, past and present, many participants may never reach. It should be understood that we are concerned here with a very tentative horizon of completion of a critical historical knowledge, aware of its limitations, built on such a reconciliation of narratives as avoids binary opposites. Between history's project of truth and memory's aim of faithfulness is that small miracle of recognition that has no equivalent in history. Ricoeur is suggesting, recognizing as we must, that what must come to be shared is beyond any narrow limitation, be it of history or memory. In order to move beyond the hospitality of narrative, a parity of esteem in the discourse of dealing with past events is necessary. It is an approach, however, that may in time create the possibility of a necessary forgiving. Remembering those voices who have been forgotten, excluded from public memory, either willfully or perhaps unwittingly, is so very important if we are serious about nurturing a comprehensive ethical public memory. We must remember too, as Ricoeur expounded so well, that there is a reciprocal relationship between remembering and forgetting, which affects both the perception of shared historical experience and the production of historical narratives. Approaching anew the tasks of remembering and forgetting in an ethical way is transformative. As philosopher Hannah Arendt has written, forgiveness is the only way to undo the irreversible flow of history. Forgiveness is the necessary corrective for the inevitable damages that result from action. Without being forgiven, released from the consequences of what we have done, our capacity to act would, as it were, be confined to one single deed from which we could never recover. We would remain the victims of consequence forever. Thus, it is only through such an ethical remembering as we now have an opportunity to attempt to undertake that we can avoid revisiting the blinding categories of censure or denunciation, or indeed revenge and bitterness. Memory of Ireland's War of Independence is complicated by the fact that it was followed so closely by the Civil War, resulting as it did in certain events and figures from the War of Independence, often receiving less attention than the subsequent Civil War. Ethical remembering requires us to include those who may hitherto have been excluded from official, formal accounts of history, and to shine a light on overlooked figures and actions in an attempt to have a more comprehensive and balanced perspective on the independence struggle. For example, the different social class background from which volunteers came is important, as is the level at which they had the possibility to participate. Those who participated in the struggle for Irish independence constitute a long spectrum that stretches from academics of emancipatory disposition through insecure smallholders, agricultural labourers with little rights, to shop boys and trades. They each sought independence, I suggest, through the prism of their social class experiences. A central dimension of ethical remembering is a refusal of any kind of conscious or unconscious amnesia, not only of persons, but events. Indeed, to reject important, if painful, events of the past is to deny those affected by them recognition of their losses or the right to have memories of those losses. I repeat that I believe to do this would be counterproductive and potentially immoral. Ethical remembering entails, too, the inclusion of the voices of the marginalized and the disenfranchised in our recollections of the past. It must show a willingness to do justice, for example, to the essential roles played by women in this period that we now commemorate. Sinead McCool has written that women were, quote, the eyes and ears of the conflict, providing safe houses, procuring arms, visiting prisons, spying, and relaying vital intelligence and messages. While we have details of this in their pension applications in the 1920s and in other decades too, their work in the struggle for independence was for too long neither recognized nor treated with any parity in terms of respect with male counterparts. Ethical recall should also include an examination of under-researched or avoided areas, such as the violence against women that occurred during this period. The examples of sexual violence that occurred during the War of Independence and the later Civil War can be viewed, as Professor Linda Connolly of Maynooth University has argued, as a dark secret of the period's historiography. Commemorations should not ignore horrific acts such as head-shorning and sexual violence, including the raping of women. It is important too, however, to recognize the complexity that arises in seeking to differentiate between what were strategic acts of a military campaign and what were, in particular situations, acts carried out from a mixture of motivations, acts of cruelty, old hatreds, envy, or greed. It is imperative that the Irish Revolution is not perceived as a war solely about or achieved by men. The civilian impact, where women come decisively into play, is so often neglected in the historical narratives of the period. The experience of women must be considered comprehensively, together with an examination of social class, if the commemoration of the War of Independence is to address seriously the most difficult questions of the past. Gender-based violence occurred and was inflicted with cruelty. It is an aspect of the revolutionary period that has been hidden, suppressed, and denied for too long. It deserves a proper contextual examination. The assumptions as to what was to be the role of women in Irish society was, of course, to become a slow-burning issue that would reveal so much of what was bad and exclusionary, rather than what might be good and inclusive, right into our own times. We must face the exclusionary nature of the state that emerged a century ago. We must muster the courage to face the role played by institutions, including religious institutions, in providing the fuel and the exclusionary language for what became confessionalisms that foster division, not cooperation. The ethics of commemoration entails inclusivity being placed center stage, an openness to dissonant voices and stories of the other, the stranger, the enemy of yesterday. We must also, through commemoration of the Irish centenary, face up to, acknowledge, and come to a form of reconciliation with some of the thorniest aspects of the struggle for independence and the later practice of that independence, including the lingering sources of violence, be they land-based, local disputes, gender-based, treatment of prisoners, and particularly those based on stereotypes of the other from both sides. I have written elsewhere as to how in the British case, the stereotypes that related to the Irish and other colonised peoples involved the othering of people, cultures and ideologies, their being regarded as inferior. Stereotypes were employed as instruments that rejected or ignored the humanity and dignity of those being colonised. I've also written of what a powerful moment it would constitute if a number of European societies made a public recognition of this, particularly in relation to Africa. By way of response in the Irish case, there was no scarcity of figures responsible for past horrific acts of abuse, humiliation, and indifference to poverty that could be drawn on as figures to describe and depict present opponents. The othering of particular cultures, particular nationalities, particular attributes, and particular ideologies served, for example, as an insidious rationalization of and distorted logic behind British Crown Forces' acts of violence, such as the collective punishments and reprisals to which I referred earlier. We must also be cognizant of stereotypical depictions of the other by some of those on the nationalist side as a process of generating a form of Anglophobia, which has been utilised and exists in some quarters to this day, and is perhaps being fuelled by the worst aspects and feared consequences of Brexit. Ibenophobia, as it is sometimes called, was a deep current in the late 19th and early 20th century Britain. But prejudice against the Irish, particularly as a migrant people or as members of particular religious denominations, was not just confined to Victorian Britain, but was also evident in the United States, centred on the stereotyping of the Irish as inherently violent, alcoholic, and unintelligent. It was a depiction that continued into and throughout the 20th century. The response to it helped fuel actions that were horrific and were delivered against a civilian British public with whom they should have been able to see a common culture. Thus, one form of hate reinforced another. There existed, it has to be recognised, a supportive intellectual tradition of pejorative attitudes towards the Irish by sections of British scholarship, which had been well formed by this period. It includes, for example, Scottish philosopher David Hume, who, having made a distinguished contribution to philosophy and its methods, that as an intellectual of influence could have made a significant contribution to upending such stereotypes. However, he was to write regressively in his History of England, the Irish from the beginning of time had been buried in the most profound barbarism and ignorance, and as they were never conquered, even indeed by the Romans, from whom all the Western world derives its culture, they continued still in the most rude state of society, and were distinguished by those vices to which human nature, not tamed by education, nor restrained by laws, is forever subject. Indeed, 2 centuries later, Winston Churchill, claiming a distance from Irishness based on an assumed superiority, would write, "We have always found the Irish to be a bit odd. They refuse to be English." The othering of Irish people and their culture was undeniably ingrained at significant levels of British society during the Revolutionary era. And in Ireland, this drew in turn a deep, hostile and comprehensive othering of what might be considered English or British or alien. Clearly, the challenge we face all comes down in our present use of commemoration to the necessity of us making a new journey together, based on better principles in terms of recalling history and memories. Such a task was well described by His Royal Highness Prince Charles on the occasion of his speech at a Central Remembrance ceremony in Berlin recently. He ended his remarks with the words, "As our countries begin this new chapter in our long history, let us reaffirm our bond for the years ahead. Let us reflect on all that we've been through together and all that we've learned, let us remember all victims of war, tyranny, and persecution, those who laid down their lives for the freedoms we cherish, and those who struggle for these freedoms to this day. They inspire us to strive for a better tomorrow. Let us make this our common cause. For too long, our understanding of the decade 1912 to 1922 and the surrounding period was hindered by an assumption that we can more easily make sense of events, and indeed our own sense of individual and national identity, if we keep historical narratives brief, simple, and homogeneous. We must challenge the urge to oversimplify as we commemorate. Embracing complexity is important. Complex events demand a scholarship that respects complexity, that seeks to unravel perceived contradictions rather than invest in or rely on simplistic reiterations that lead away from any deep knowledge and that may go on to assist in accommodating ideological manipulation. We must recognize, too, that in the context of commemorating, understanding and even empathizing is not the same as endorsing or valorizing. It is not about celebrating merely the actions of those who won. It seeks to gain a fuller picture of the events occurring during the decade leading to independence itself. We have to recall not only the participants of war and rebellion, but also to recognize all of those who suffered in the midst and in its wake. As Declan Corbett has written, the stories of the past had celebrated the wrong people, the smiters of the world rather than the smitten. If I may in summary then return to the tools we might use in our new journey together, I have referred in other speeches to the work of Richard Kearney in this area of ethical remembering, and to his astute observation that engagement with the plurality and diversity of various narratives could over time contribute to a culture of forgiveness. Forgiveness, reconciliation, and healing must remain important and necessary objectives. They constitute our best realistic hope of coming to terms with the past. Forgiveness is difficult, but not impossible. The purpose of forgiving, as Hannah Arendt saw it, was to diminish a past event's capacity to deprive one of the realistic possibilities of the present or the imaginative possibilities of the future. Forgiveness is not an abstract act summoned up by an individual to address a particular wrong. It is a conscious, even painful act, and it can be the genesis of a new relationship forged between the forgiven and the forgiver. Engaging with the past is often not easy. On the contrary, it involves a complex negotiation of the manifold stories, memories, hearts, legacies, and emotions, for example, of all who recall the revolutionary period leading up to independence, or were or are affected by what is too lightly called the Troubles. Finding a fair and comprehensive way of dealing with the past, one that will win the confidence and support of all, is a daunting challenge. However, it is a challenge that on moral grounds cannot be and should not be, I believe, shirked. It is the basis for us all, not only of hope, but for the achievement of a new version of a life, one of fulfillment for all on our island and for all in our neighbourhood. For the sake of the future, we must break loose from the snares of the past. In facing up to that challenge, let us ensure then that our approach is characterized by a desire to remember ethically, to view forgiveness as a true release from the past, and to move forward to a new chapter unburdened by any bitter memory of that past, free to make of our imagining an emancipatory, inclusive achievement in laying out conditions for an enduring peace. In that process of re-engagement, we on this island of Ireland we share can, across a distance of a century, understand the events of a century ago as being about so much more than military or political actions. They also, of course, represented an act of imagination, a part of a social as well as a national revolution, whose leaders were inspired by the idea of creating a very different, much improved Ireland, founded on the old republican values of equality and liberty. All of this was done in the context of a turbulent time in empire history, in which global challenges were being mounted to relations between those who ruled and those who were being ruled. It was a time of a mass destruction, of a pandemic, the wrongly named Spanish flu, of which people were afraid, too numbed, too busy in conflict to speak. It was the aftermath of World War I. Empires were being reforged, and across the world, an urge for self-determination, including across the colonized world, was stirring. In Ireland, too, popular mandates, power realities, economic and social forces, choices, actors, and passions all became key contextual components of our struggle for independence. Opportunities for peaceful transitions were forfeited. Cold military measures were invoked rather than the making of any sophisticated or informed, meaningful diplomatic or institutional responses to the stated will of the people as had been expressed through the ballot box. While in the best of its rhetoric, in the hearts of its most selfless participants, it was an Ireland of equality and social justice that was sought, an Ireland of democratic citizenship and of collective participation. Succeeding institutions would contradict rather than deliver such outcomes. As we re-engage with the ideals that lay behind this period in history, we are also invited to revisit our conceptions of what constitutes a real republic, a republic that would have solidarity, community, and the public world at its heart, a republic fit for a shared island of diverse traditions, hopes, and loyalties, a republic that would acknowledge the state not only as benign, but as active, as a shared responsibility, and recognize, too, its vital role in actively improving the common welfare of all citizens. This conception of a shared island, of the state and the republic, is so much richer than any narrow individualistic definition of citizenship. And it is also, I suggest, closer to what the more idealistic leaders of this period of 100 years ago had in mind. They, in their generation, included advanced thinkers, selfless women and men, who took all the risks to ensure that the children of Ireland would in the future live in freedom and be fulfilled with their fair share of Ireland's cultural, social, and economic advancements. The passage of 100 years allows us to see the past afresh, free from some of the narrow partisan interpretations that might have restricted our view in earlier periods. We have a duty to honour and respect that past and retrieve the heroic idealism that was at its heart. We have an even greater duty to imagine and to forge a future illuminated by the unfulfilled promises of our past. This requires reviving the best of the idealism of this period so that coming generations might experience freedom in the full sense of the term. Freedom from poverty, freedom from violence and insecurity, and freedom from fear. May I conclude by suggesting that the time has come for such an ethics of narrative hospitality as might replace our past entrenchments on this island, that we make possible all the best of our futures together. We have in the past experienced lost opportunities in the context of reconciliation from our violent struggle for independence and what followed it. But we now have an opportunity, as we mark the commemorative centenary, to seek true lasting reconciliation on this island and build a bright, emancipatory future for all of us with our diverse histories and memories respectfully taken into account. As we continue to mark these pivotal moments in our nation's history, let us together cultivate memory as an instrument for the living, so that we may realize a collective memory at peace, unburdened, reconciled, an ethical remembering with a special energy and capacity to replace our past entrenchments, as well as offering an openness to others. Let us together strive to nurture memory and remembrance as a strong foundation of a shared, agreed future. Garamila Mahagi Galer, Isberbanach Don Togreshe.
Thank you, President Higgins, for that paper. Responding to it now, we have four speakers. Kieran Benson is Emeritus Professor of Psychology in University College Dublin and has degrees in Social Psychology and the Philosophy of Art. He is a former Chairman of the Arts Council, currently chairs Poetry Ireland, and anticipates that the All-Ireland Poetry Ireland Centre will be completed in Dublin's Parnell Square to mark the concluding phase in the decades of centenaries. Professor Kieran Benson.
Ogdron, colleagues, I'd like to say a few words about the idea of the past and ethical remembrance. If as a citizen you aspire to and work to affirm ideals of forgiveness, reconciliation, harmony, equality, justice, inclusiveness, and a generalized orientation to a common good, then collective acts of remembrance of an ethical kind will appeal to you. To understand why and how ethical memorialization impacts our commemorative thinking about the War of Independence and the Irish Civil War, we need, as the President argues, to frame our thinking about these acts more critically than perhaps we've been accustomed to. My colleagues, as historians, will contextualize the particular details of those momentous events for this island. These last centenaries of our decade of centenaries are especially difficult, precisely because of the kinds of division that the events of those few years seared into the structures of Irish political and civic life for the last 100 years. Cleavages within the Republic, fractures within Northern Ireland, ruptures between the Republic and Northern Ireland, and between both and Great Britain. What I want to outline as footnotes to the President's call are some general philosophical and psychological contexts for the ethics and for the practice of memory. For brevity's sake, I rely on an argument for an ethics of memory from the Israeli philosopher Avishai Margalit. Margalit writes against the backdrop of remembering that most extreme example of historical evil, still within living memory, the Holocaust. Tested against this extreme, his case for ethical memory, I think, fits our present purpose. This period of commemoration is an opportunity to reflect on where, as a state, we have come from, and indeed, had things been different, where we might have gone. Two strands fabricate the past for us: history and memory. In critical history, colder and more detached as Margalit sees it, there is no backward causality. We cannot affect the past or revivify the past. Only descriptions of the past can be altered, improved, or animated. In sharp contrast, memory, in the form of stories about the past that are shared by a community, are as a rule more vivid, more concrete, and better connected with live experiences than is critical history. So how should we understand the past? Let's take a brief detour through the findings of contemporary psychology before returning to this idea of commemoration viewed through the lens of ethical memory. Our ideas about the past, about time and memory, shape our assumptions and prime our expectations of what is possible to change in our relationship to the past. Reflections on the idea of the past challenge our common sense notions of time. Here are some questions, the answers to which prompt both caution and optimism. Is the past in the past? Or should we think of the past as having a future? The eminent German historian Reinhard Koselleck titled his magnum opus Futures Past. Here I would like to briefly reflect on the idea of the past's future. Can we anticipate our past? Concepts of time are central to how we order our experience, both personally and collectively. But concepts of time vary greatly from one historical period to another, from one culture to another, from one language to another, from one discipline to another. In our everyday language, we actually think of time spatially. The present is here, the past is behind, and the future is in front. In other words, we think of time using the metaphor of space. And this allows us to think of time as being short or long, and of events as receding from us or as approaching towards us. The point here is that our ideas of the past and our metrics for temporally ordering those remembered or recalled events and experiences, such as clock time, are constantly open to change and revision. Consequently, the past is constantly open to change and revision, be it personally remembered or historically constructed. The more we learn from newly discovered materials in archives or letters, the more we can anticipate changes in the past. Just as the more we create new frameworks of understanding and attend to newly noticed domains of neglect in an existing canon, the more, that is, the past can be reinterpreted and reconfigured. To say that the past arises from the present is not in any way to deny cause and effect in the enrolling of events that have run their course. It is to emphasize that the past is a set of ideas whose use depends on memories and imaginings that function in the present and that reflect the concerns of the present. For the issue of commemorations, then, we should pay detailed attention to the demands and dynamics of our present time in order to decide upon the purposes of historical remembrance. A key point is this, as the Northern Irish writer and poet Gerald Dawe has pointed out. In our present reflections, one of the things we know is the outcome of the past. Their past, as it was, with its options and scope for decisions then, is not our past as it is. Dawe can later ask how a common past can now be achieved or even remembered. And he goes on to say that the past is not an ethereal thing, but is contained in things and actions. So we have here again the idea of a commonly agreed past being formed as an ambition, as a future goal. Seamus Heaney wrote of the past as the ghost life that hovers over the furniture of our lives, where to an imaginative person, such furniture becomes a point of entry into a common emotional ground of memory and belonging. Dawe and Heaney are not in disagreement in their respective uses of the words not ethereal and ghost life in describing our senses of the past. Modern psychology and neuroscience confirms that when we remember, whether individually or arguably collectively, we do not retrieve some fixed and immutable trace. We constantly reconstruct and reimagine subject to present demands. The past is endlessly edited and re-edited. If the past is what is remembered, what can we say about the kinds of way there are of remembering? This is a vast and ever-expanding field of study, so let me abstract just a few ideas of relevance. There are many kinds of memory. Two of the most important are the ways in which we can each time travel back to episodes in our own past. That's called episodic memory. And the ways in which we can recall what we know. That's semantic memory. If episodic memory is a unique capacity of humans, it also lasts only as long as the human is alive. Each kind of memory conjures its own sense of time and of its past, and each nourishes the other. If episodic memories are what make witnesses, they also die with those witnesses. Insofar as they are part of collective memory, their lifespan is about 2 generations. And what they then are, as historians like Jay Winter remind us, are memories of memories, or post-memories. Some scholars would prefer the term distributive memory to that of collective memory. But it is another kind of memory that seems particularly important at the present time, and that is emotional memory, and especially negative emotional memories, which we know play an outsized role compared to positive emotional memories in our lives. Whatever kinds of positive emotions, of pride and admiration there might be in nationalistic opposition to imperialist or colonialist ideas, the kinds of negative emotion that attach to the fratricidal divisions of the Civil War are of a different order: bitterness, resentment, humiliation, irreconcilability. One concept mentioned by the President, that of reprisal, which is a species of collective revenge, lies at the heart of some of the most egregious events of that time. Bloody Sunday, the assassinations, the 81 official executions of Republican prisoners, Ballyseedy. The question, how could they, transmuted into a more enduring and troublesome question: how could we? As Margaret points out, it is caring that marks out what is important to us, and caring is emotional. Emotional memories are strong determinants of adversarial allegiances and identities, of who we are and of who we are not, of who is with us and of who is against us, and indeed of the kind of person or society that we must not become. The simple everyday phrase, "I regard that as history now," as Michael Fitzgerald QC recently said concerning the killing of his uncle on the morning of November the 21st, 1920 by Michael Collins' squad, that is a discursive indication of the limits of emotional memory. So what are the purposes and uses of memory, individual or collective? Memory is fundamentally prospective. It supplies what we need to imagine what is to come, to imagine what ought to come, and to imagine what, if at all possible, should not come to be. A difference between history and collective memory is the difference between arguments and chronicles. Each feeds the construction of identities. These involve choices, and memory informs decision-making. Memory guides the construction of possible futures, and insofar as these futures concern those with whom we are most connected, our families, friends, comrades, fellow citizens, fellow members of commonly imagined communities, and so on, then we are in the realm of ethical memory, as argued by Margaret and by the President. Given the malleability of the past, its openness to review and to reinterpretation, its imaginary scene setting, its changing potency over historical timescales, its transmissibility in object and action, there is for us now a great opportunity to deliberately shape our own responses to the foundational events of modern Ireland. Our acts of remembrance can become, without denial, distortion, or suppression, instruments for a more ethically oriented Ireland, one that is open to difference and to conviviality in the best sense of that word. Here are Margaret's conclusions about ethical memory. Slightly tongue-in-cheek, he observes that a nation has famously been defined as a society that nourishes a common delusion about its ancestry and shares a common hatred for its neighbours. Thus, the bond of caring in a nation hinges on false memory, delusion, and hatred of those who do not belong. His concern is to diminish the extent to which wounding emotions, the scars of painful memory, can motivate political action. By contrast, what binds an ethical community together are positive emotional bonds. These may be forged in the solidarity of testing times and indeed in hostility towards a common enemy, but the sense of solidarity is crucial. Our knowledge of the past is rooted in credible witnessing, in a hierarchy of those we trust. Margaret goes on to argue that the case for the redemptive power of forgiveness, but of a forgiveness, he goes on to argue the case for the redemptive power of forgiveness, but of a forgiveness that is based on disregarding the sin rather than forgetting it. Here, the idea of disregarding and of forgiveness is of both as voluntary actions and chosen policy. He offers the idea of remorse as a non-magical way of undoing the past by changing our interpretation of that past. Remorse empowers forgiveness. Here I'm reminded of that letter in 1970 from the Commandant of Beggars Bush Barracks, Sean Kirwan, which Anne Dolan uses to such powerful effect in her book Commemorating the Irish Civil War. Irwin was charged with executing his former comrades. All those years later, in 1970, his anguish and anger as the mandated executioner carrying out the orders of the new state is still poignantly raw. And I quote, "It is impossible to describe the harrowing and the anguish of the soul of having to see one-time comrades in arms brought out and shot to death by a firing squad, and to be aware that these men did not really know what it was all about." What would a fine commemoration of genuine political remorse look like? It would, I think, involve a commitment never to act like that again. But more importantly, it would commit to generalise that remorse to a universal norm, such that the nation as a whole would politically support international agreements and conventions that would outlaw all such actions, as, by example, signing the 1949 Geneva Conventions regarding the treatment of prisoners. This is Kant's categorical imperative collectively obeyed. Act only according to that maxim, by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Perhaps the strongest reason for forgiveness is this, that those who find themselves in the position to forgive are also the beneficiaries of the act, since feelings of resentment coupled with desires for revenge poison those who hold them. And here's a wish from Gerald Daw in 2004, and I quote, "Maybe from these hidden, uncanonical sources, a common culture will emerge or resurface, out of which the next generation can mine diversity of background as a bulwark against deadly and deadening division, and not the other way around." And here is a question for now. Should our commemorative projects not aspire to become what Heaney called points of entry into a common emotional ground of memory and belonging? This, as I understand it, is what the President is arguing for. Thank you.
Kieran Benson, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Anne Dolan, Associate Professor of Modern Irish History and a Fellow of Trinity College, Dublin. Her most recent book with William Murphy is Michael Collins' The Man and the Revolution, and her groundbreaking book commemorating the Irish Civil War, History and Memory, 1923-2000, introduced this field of research to many Irish readers. She's a member of the Expert Advisory Group on Centenary Commemorations. Anne Dolan.
Uachtaráin, colleagues, it's an honour to be here. A coat can tell a lot about a man, not just whether he was clean or he was careless, but with Thomas McGrath's coat we can see that he was loved and that he'd be missed. Someone had sewn a medal into the lining at the collar, someone had taken the trouble, someone wanted him minded, but the sainted medal didn't bring him any luck. A marriage certificate in his pocket said he had a wife for all of 2 months, while a scrap of paper pinned to his lapel said he met his maker knowing she would bear the burden of the letters that spelled out spy. And we can know all this only from a coat. Torn pages found nearby show the attempts it took to write those 3 letters, S, P and Y. The crossed out, thrown away tries might say much of an unpracticed or of a nervous, unsteady hand, but there is something more in all the times it took to get such a short word right. Bits of paper and a coat, like so many of all the other things that we can find, all the mix and gatherum of so very many lives in the Irish Revolution, leave us with a choice. It is a stark one, perhaps, for those who come to the period with the weight of a centenary, with the onus to commemorate, or to cultivate memory as an instrument for the living, as the President said. But it is a familiar one for most historians of the period. How do we choose to handle the violence at its heart? The President's plea for ethical remembering is perhaps a timely prompt for historians of the period to reflect on their own priorities and practice. If we can get inside one man's pocket, under the lining of his coat, we are clearly spoiled for the choice of paths that we can bring into the light, and we should be acutely conscious of the consequences of putting them in its glare. We know we make mistakes, we come to the wrong conclusions, we doubt, and doubt drives us back again and again with none of the certainty of commemoration's promise of remembrance, none of the urgency of a centenary's one chance to get it right. We worry away at the past, whether it is the 97th, 98th or 99th anniversary, and we'll still be there when most everyone else has forgotten the 101st. The Irish Revolution is now a very different place to the one I first learned about. The students and historians I see working on it, driven by the richness of what we can now know, are undertaking thoughtful, engaging, challenging research that certainly doesn't shy away from dealing with the hardest questions this past makes it possible for us to ask. There are fewer who aspire to be keepers of the flame, more who think in terms of a global revolution than who shot who in Cork, and more who take their cue from the methods of a Status Calavas rather than the memoirs of a Tom Barry or a Dan Breen. Which is why the President's paper gave me considerable pause for thought. The challenges of commemoration he identifies seem older than I expected. They reflect or touch upon debates the historiography already knows are fundamental, debates that are already inherent and even somewhat outgrown, yet they still clearly underline current commemorative concerns. We need only look to the vandalism at Glasnevin Cemetery's commemorative wall for a second time in February 2020 for proof, or to some of the more than 200 messages the then Taoiseach received, one telling him he was a treacherous Tory piece of, well, you can fill in the rest, when there was mention of a possible commemoration of the Royal Irish Constabulary in January this year. Which perhaps begs the question if, as the President suggests, history is the framework for what public remembering we choose to do, could history be doing a slightly better job? The tension between history and commemoration is an old and hoary chestnut, and I don't intend to roll it out again here. I know as the historian I'm the luckier one. I'm not compelled to see if the past can fix us, and I'm blunt enough to think we only have ourselves to blame for what happens now. But that said, even I can see how faded those wreaths laid in the Garden of Remembrance by President Machnamh and Queen Elizabeth seem, how long ago those visits by Enda Kenny and David Cameron to Messine, to the Men in Gate now feel, and how all that talk of shared histories and being close as good neighbours should always be has been clamoured out by sharper, harsher sounds. Brexit, Brits and border polls are part of the vocabulary of a very different time. So maybe history's job is to make it harder to be so certain and so shrill. Part of the problem is the register that commemoration seems to work in. The President's paper ends with reference to our duty to honour and respect that past and retrieve the heroic idealism that was at its heart. Again, the historian, I think, has the easier task. I just have to try and see it for what it was. The President has to forge his hospitality of narratives, but many of our narratives still seem tied to a centenary calendar packed with dates and events that a Countess Markievicz or a Michael Collins might have picked. If someone had marked the centenary of, say, the introduction of the old age pension back in 2009, we might have actually found a moment of shared history, a moment that improved the lot of every person on this island and the next. But in the centenary stakes, the old age pension doesn't set pulses racing and the anthem singing. While that may seem a rather contrary point, it is a sort of fundamental one all the same. Whose pasts are we interested in commemorating, and just how inclusive are we really prepared to be? If we accept that commemoration is largely concerned with the more obvious political moments, that the real challenge of ethical remembering revolves around the violence of this past, who are we prepared to listen to when it comes to the violence of the period, and what are some of the consequences of that choice? If we can make our way into the pocket of Thomas McGrath's coat, what does history and commemoration do with that? So much of the evidence seems to suggest that the very basic things we take as certainties might be wrong. In April 1922, John Gunn was disbanded from the RIC on a Thursday, made it back to Ennis, where he had been stationed for 27 years, to Ennis, where he was to be married, and by Sunday he was shot dead. There were others killed like Gunn, others like John Haughey given 5 days to quit the country, who fled to London, leaving a wife and 8 children behind. For them and for many more, for those who fled and those who were fled from, there was none of the clarity about where one war ended and another began that we now seem so sure of. The more we see of the records, the more the distinctions begin to blur. Irishmen killed Irishmen and women throughout the period from 1916 onwards. There's a quality to the violence of the Civil War that is clearly to be found in the years that had just gone before. The truce period, as we traditionally know it, those months from July 1921 to June 1922, can only be conceived as peaceful if we turn a blind eye to the continued use of violence, if we overlook those who go missing, those shot and killed, those driven out, those local settlings of old scores. Also, the sequence of events we accept from 1918 onwards, through the War of Independence, and we cannot even agree on a title for that, through the truce, through the Civil War, makes no sense if we follow what becomes Northern Ireland's trajectory of violence. Violence increases there during the truce period. It eases but continues through 1922 and 1923, but it never really gets included in what we define as the Irish Civil War. There is a messiness about the whole period, a quality to the violence that makes for many civil wars that bleed beyond the margins we have largely drawn for a kind of chronological convenience, so we can set our wars apart, classify them all neat and tidily away, and that is just the margins of the easy parts. The history of violence, the kinds of questions historians have been asking of violence for many years now, take us more and more to the experience of violence itself, to its meanings, to the sense of what violence asked of those who fought, to what it did to those who suffered in its wake. And the military service pensions collection is showing us, as we have never really seen before, the participants' sense of what was done and at what costs. In August 1924, Michael White wrote to W.T. Cosgrave to remind him, "I have lost a lot by fighting for my country." And while it would serve to put his sentiments down to anger and frustration with the state of poverty he found himself in, there is the history of something else here at work, the history of the used up and the disappointed, the history of something, perhaps a feeling, that the best of everything is behind you and that you deeply want it to be someone else's fault. In May 1935, at the age of 38, Edward Devitt put it this way: "During the years 1918 to 1923, I gave all my attention and time to the cause of the Republic, the most important years of a man's life between the age of 21 and 26. I let slip without thinking of my future, depending on my country to look after me in case of need." And £13, 1 shilling and a penny per annum was all he got for what he thought he'd lost. Maybe I'm suggesting a history of resignation, maybe even a history of regret, but regret not so much for what had been done or with what they had been asked to do, but rather with what life after had not gone on to become. Decades of ambivalence is a much more interesting force to reckon with than the public stories of heroics shined up like the medals for every Easter parade. Ambivalence is much more difficult to commemorate. Inclusiveness is not just about who we are prepared to hear, but also what we are prepared to hear them say. Charles Dalton is a fascinating example of the nature of telling, of what he felt he could and couldn't say, of how versions evolve, of the compunction to tell over and over again. And he certainly had plenty of chances to tell. Dalton was interviewed by Ernie O'Malley. He gave a Bureau of Military History statement. He made his pension application and he wrote a memoir with the Dublin Brigade, published in 1929. While his memoir acknowledged the overwhelming impulse to flee what had been done on Bloody Sunday morning, he writes, "I started to run. I could no longer control my overpowering need to run, to fly, to leave behind me those threatening streets. That later, as he put it before the altar, I thought over our morning's work and offered up a prayer for the fallen." His public Bloody Sundays were very different to his private ones, that for all he did not want to tell, there was more others did not want to really hear. But the challenges of the sources go beyond that. Charles Dalton comes to us from the pages of his pension application, where we find him for a time a patient in St. Patrick's and Grangegorman hospitals, as a victim of what he was made to do, barely even an actor in his own wars. But while he strikes a sympathetic figure in his own application, so too do the parents of Eamon Hughes when an application was made on their behalf for a dependence allowance. Described as both broken down completely physically and mentally, Mark Hughes was the clerk who could no longer work, Annie Hughes the music teacher who could no longer teach, because their teenage son had been killed, possibly by Charles Dalton, on the 7th of October 1922. In 1933, the Pension Board was requested not to even send letters about the application to their home, because over a decade after, they still could not bear the mention of their son's death. Is commemoration agile enough to accommodate all the hurt in all of that? The President's plea for the inclusion of marginalised voices is particularly striking in terms of how he frames the inclusion of women. As the only woman here among 5 men, I feel obliged to say that there are far more women then as well as now to find. Do we want to know of Mary Hurley, who helped keep Mrs. Lindsay captive in the weeks before she was killed by the IRA? Of Annie Waters, as she recalled before a military court in June 1921, how she watched her 2 sons die, how she heard the shots fired into their bodies? Do we want to hear her voice as she identified their remains, confirming their ages, 19, 21? Is it easy to let her voice fade away and stay with the politics of whose side the Waters boys were on? Do we want to know of Kate Marr, because she was used up by a group of British soldiers in December 1920 and left for dead on a patch of waste ground? Will we remember all the women dragged into things they had no desire to be part of by husbands, sons, brothers, by being in the wrong place at precisely the wrong time, like Kate Burke, hit by the shatter of a bomb while on her few days' holidays in Dublin in April 1921? Can we include the many more men and women who lived in a world around revolution, who avoided it when they could, who worked and lived in its midst, who can be readily found in its records if we choose to look? What of Alexander Allen, a 50-year-old widower with 8 sons, who was killed in Belfast, keen to get to the second house performance, rushing to the Empire Theatre after a week in the shipyards, after a week with all those boys? What of the commercial traveller who took his own life because the Belfast boycott had left him without work? It is in their midst that we might have the best chance of finding that which is shared, that which is most hospitable about this past, even if it is because of the records generated by violence that we can find them. It is the many mundane, amicable interactions, the everyday accommodations people made across the things that divided them, that when it came to it meant that our wars were never as bad as they might have been. Sometimes in a history of violence, as E.P. Thompson says, it is the restraint rather than the disorder which is remarkable. It might be time to give the history and commemoration of restraint a try. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne. Michael Laffan is our next speaker, Professor Emeritus in University College Dublin, where he taught history for over 30 years. His most important publications are The Resurrection of Ireland, the Sinn Féin Party, 1916 to 1923, and Judging W.T. Cosgrave. He's a leading authority on the history of that eventful decade, which is marked by the centenary of Commemorations. As well as being an Irishman, he sees himself as a European and insists that he is a citizen of the world, despite Theresa May's disparagement of that latter term. Michael Laffan.
I appreciate the opportunity to join in responding to President Higgins's wide-ranging and stimulating address. In particular, as a historian like Anne Dolan, I welcome the chance to illustrate or to elaborate on a few of the approaches he has outlined. Prominent among these is his insistence that although some centenaries are more esteemed than others, commemorations should be open to different narratives of historical experience. In particular, they should include the narratives of the other, the enemy of yesterday. They should not censor the memory of painful events, even though aspects of the past can often be embarrassing or distasteful. In our commemorations, we should take heed of Eric Hobsbawm's shrewd warning. It is not a question of the people constantly remembering. They remember because someone is constantly reminding them. We should try to ensure that those who remind, normally governments, do so in a generous and inclusive spirit. As Emmett O'Connor wrote recently, annual state commemorations normally focus on one or two big events chosen not for their historical weight, but because they are deemed emblematic of how the regime would like to see itself. Commemorative rituals have become historical forces in their own right. They can provide occasions for inventing traditions. It's even possible there are too many commemorations. Whenever we find historical distortion, whether by the state, by groups, or by individuals, it is the task of historians to point this out, even at the risk of making themselves unpopular. Historians have a dual role. One is to try to understand what happened, why, and with what consequences, to discover what the past was like, to see it in its own terms, often strange or even alien, to avoid tidying it up, gentrifying it, projecting back into it some of our own ideals or fantasies. History is a record of what one age finds interesting in another. But in looking at our ancestors, we should avoid the enormous condescension of posterity. We should not mock the dead by distorting them and their beliefs. We should not search the past simply in pursuit of reassuring things we want to find. And we should avoid a Whig interpretation of history in which everything leads naturally and inexorably towards the present. But, on the other hand, we also have to try to understand how the past relates to the present. In effect, how we came to be what we are, and how others came to be what they are. And it is in this sense that history is used, and sometimes abused, for purposes of commemoration. In the context of the Irish Revolution, the others should include innocent victims of violence, such as children, the defeated parliamentary party, whose vision of a home rule Ireland within the United Kingdom was destroyed between 1916 and 1918. And losers, such as the minorities in the two new political entities that emerged in 1921 and 22, Northern Nationalists and Southern Unionists. The others should include the triumphant Ulster Unionists, and also the British, who had their own perceived national and political interests, in particular, a refusal at that time to accept the idea of an Irish republic. These were often at odds with the interests of many or most Irish people, and therefore a particular effort may be needed to understand them. In responding to the President's request for openness to multiple narratives, we must see the Irish Revolution in a wider international context. And from this standpoint, it's striking how mild and moderate were the changes that resulted. Despite persistent urban poverty, there was little social unrest, largely because many Irish grievances had been resolved. Under British rule, particularly under Conservative rule, Ireland had already experienced its great social revolution, the change in ownership of most of the land from Unionist landlords to tenant farmers. This transformation, too, deserves commemoration. The violence that played a central role in bringing about the new Irish state was limited in scale, especially when it is seen against the background of the Great War. The toll of violent deaths between 1916 and 1921 has recently been calculated at under 3,000, 500 of them in the Easter Rising. In the same week as the Rising, the Irish 16th Division suffered 570 killed and over 1,400 wounded, and the total number of Irish soldiers killed in the war was over 27,000. British losses in Ireland between January 1919 and July 1921 were less than those of an average day on the Western Front. Irish revolutionaries were fortunate in their opponents. After the Easter Rising, 90 rebels were sentenced to death, but only 15 of them were executed. This is a modest figure compared with the 15,000 who were shot after the suppression of the Paris Commune, or the 1,500 executed after the failure of the Kronstadt revolt against the Soviets in 1921, let alone the murder or expulsion by the Turks of 1.5 million Armenians between 1915 and 1922. Empires normally fight to maintain their possessions. A great power does not die in its bed. We should not be surprised that Britain used force to suppress rebellion in Ireland, or that until May 1921 it refused to contemplate the idea of Irish Dominion status. The President rightly draws attention to the atrocities carried out by the Black and Tans and auxiliaries, to their policy of exemplary collective punishments, reprisals, and economic destruction. But sadly, in all guerrilla campaigns, government forces resort to brutal and bloody measures. Individuals suffered, and their suffering should not be ignored. But Ireland's experience a century ago was benign compared with other more recent victims of, for example, the wars carried out by the French in Algeria, the Americans in Vietnam, or the Soviets in Afghanistan. Even the British, who were milder than most other dominant or imperial powers, acted far more savagely elsewhere. In March 1919, 2 months after the first meeting of the Dáil, the British shot at least 379, and probably far more, peaceful Indian demonstrators at Amritsar. In 1920, they killed thousands of rebels in air and gas attacks in Iraq. The Irish were lucky to be white, not brown or black. We must continue to shun the old absurd idea that, in Liam Kennedy's words, the Irish were mope, the most oppressed people ever. They weren't. In the 20th century, the Jews, the Poles, and the Kurds are among very many whose experiences were vastly worse than those of the Irish. And the British government could be, and was, shamed into changing its attitudes and policies. And the Irish benefited from the fact that they were fighting a democracy. The centenary commemorations must acknowledge that a quarter of the Irish population wanted nothing more than to remain loyal subjects of the British Crown. They wished then, and their descendants wish now, to exercise their citizenship and collective participation within the United Kingdom and not in an Irish republic. A century ago, if a war between nationalists and unionists were to be averted, a war that might have been comparable to that which destroyed Yugoslavia in the 1990s, partition was the obvious natural solution. It had been accepted by John Redmond as a temporary expedient in 1914. It was accepted in practice, although not, of course, in theory, by the leaders of the Easter Rising 2 years later. Any attempt to stage a rebellion in Ulster would have resulted in bloody sectarian conflict, with the Unionists as the probable winners. So they confined their plans for insurrection to the 3 southern provinces. Ulster would be abandoned, and their northern followers would retreat to the safety of Connaught. In similar fashion, with only a few exceptions, the War of Independence was fought in the south and not in the north, although there was much killing in Belfast and elsewhere. Without partition, there would have been no full independence for what became the Free State. The British government did not begin to negotiate seriously with Irish nationalists until the Ulster Unionists had been satisfied, until after the Belfast Parliament and government had been established. Only then did a compromise settlement become possible. Almost exactly 100 years ago, on the 23rd of December 1920, the partition of Ireland became embedded in the law of the United Kingdom, and in a manner that reflected the balance of power in British politics. Ulster Unionists got what they wanted, the largest possible area that they could control, and, as a corollary, the area with the largest possible nationalist minority that could be controlled. The wishes of the people concerned were carefully ignored. By the standards of the 1920s, these are the only ones that really matter, it was a repudiation of the spirit of the times, of the rights of small nations. A 1/4 minority in the whole island was succeeded by a 1/3 minority in the north. The result was a pattern of discrimination and resentment that endured for half a century and that ultimately destroyed the Northern Irish state. The Fall of Stormont in 1972 has its origins in the events of 1920 and 1921. All commemorations of the Irish Revolution should include this victory, a Pyrrhic victory, of the revolution's determined enemies, the Ulster Unionists. In the south, a parallel development occurred. The British, no longer having to worry about Ulster, abandoned the Unionist minority to its fate. Embarrassed by the nature of the campaign they had waged, and feeling that Southern Ireland now caused more trouble than it was worth, they granted a degree of independence unthinkable only a few years earlier. The Protestant minority in the Free State, being small and harmless, was treated well, apart from having to make distasteful but minor concessions to Catholic beliefs and linguistic nationalism. It was lucky. In commemorating the revolutionary decade, we must appreciate that independence was achieved not only by violence, but also by the votes of most of the people, including, for the first time, the votes of women. The demand for independence was expressed by the Second Sinn Féin Party, by the Dáil, and by a formidable underground administration. We should acknowledge the remarkable attempt partly successful, not merely to wage a guerrilla campaign, but simultaneously to set up a counter-state. To a limited extent, a rebel Irish government was already functioning before the handover of power in 1922, thereby helping to preserve the Irish democratic tradition. This tradition has at times been neglected in national commemorations, which have often emphasized violence, and it deserves appropriate recognition. Commemorations need not revive old animosities, but they should reveal the past in all its complexity, both the aspects that we can admire and those that we regret or deplore. We can choose from the diverse patterns of our history those aspects that we find valuable and constructive, and try to incorporate them in our present and our future. Over time, the chosen aspects will change to match society's changing needs. This can and should be done without ignoring the negative contexts, such as hatred and discrimination, with which congenial elements were often intermixed. The Irish Revolution involved cruelty, injustice, and bloodshed. All revolutions do. Commemorations, while not glorifying such aspects, should not erase them. When the time comes to commemorate the Civil War, the atrocities carried out by both sides must be recognized, but also put in context. Civil wars are normally more vicious than wars between states. Commemorations held in the spirit of the President's remarks must be welcomed, but we should have no illusions. A generous inclusivity will prove controversial in some quarters, and it will provoke resistance. That should not be a deterrent. In recent years, there has been much to admire in the ways the country has examined and commemorated the events of a century ago, and we should build on this achievement.
Michael, thank you very much indeed. Our final speaker before we open this to debate is Joppe Leursen, Professor of European Studies at the University of Amsterdam. He's an expert on national identities and national stereotypes and editor of the authoritative Encyclopedia of Romantic Nationalism in Europe. He's also worked on Irish history and on the role of memory in Irish culture, notably in his book Remembrance and Imagination. Together with his Irish wife, the literary scholar Anne Rigney, he has edited a book on cultural centenaries entitled Commemorating Writers in 19th Century Europe, Nation Building and Centenary Fever. Professor Leursen joins us now from the University of Amsterdam.
I am delighted to join you from the Netherlands, and I would like to bring a beginning to my comments, which will chime with everything that has been said before, by quoting a few lines from a classic Dutch poem. It commemorates the Nazi occupation of my country, and it ends as follows. Come to me tonight with stories of the war and how it ended, and repeat them 100 times over. Each time tears will fill my eyes. These lines eloquently bring home to us how the past can be long ago, but the emotions are still with us and continue to define us. How memory brings people together in shared remembrance, shared stories, shared emotions, and that these stories do not wear with age, but remain powerful in each repetition. The poem is called Peace, Vrede, but it teaches us that war continues to resonate even in the peacetime that puts an end to it. At the same time, this poem is also about trauma, about the lingering damage of war. Even in peacetime, the war stays with us. It may haunt us with undiminished grief and horror. That recall can define who we are, can prevent us from ever really wiping away our tears. Piety and pity are closely related, and history can indeed become a nightmare from which we are trying to awake. This was all addressed movingly and trenchantly in the President's discourse. I should like to add a few side observations in the margin of all that, and I have 7 points to make. The first point is that when we face the past, we face a dilemma. Time sweeps us on towards the future. We inexorably move away from the past. If we lose touch with our past, we lose touch with who we are. And on the other hand, if we get stuck in the past, we lose out on what we can become. That's a conundrum. The philosopher Hegel saw a way out of this, and he called it Aufhebung. In that German word, there are 3 meanings, and each of these meanings is necessary to have a healthy relationship with the past. Aufhebung means, in the first place, to abolish, to discontinue, much as a peace treaty brings hostilities to an end. The war is over, and we need to put it behind us. In the second place, Aufheben means to preserve, to put something in safekeeping, in storage. We do not forget. We even enshrine the traces of the past in poems, in monuments, in museums, in precious things. And in the third place, Aufhebung means to lift something up, to elevate it to a higher position. The past, deactivated as it is, part of what is behind us and preserved in our cultural memory, loses its virulence and its rancor. It can become something that makes us better people, something that we can learn from. We can look back on the conflicts and hostilities of long ago, the way we look back on our youth and on our youthful follies, something that made us what we are, something we had to outgrow, and something that enriches our store of experience. Hegel's Aufhebung works best when the past is very long ago. We can look back dispassionately at the disagreements between Daniel O'Connell and Thomas Davis. By now, we realize that both men were right and wrong in their own ways, and that despite their differences, both were equally part of a higher truth that we have moved towards since then. But in other cases, memories, certainly of more recent conflicts, are more rebarbative. Nonetheless, sooner or later, and this is my second point, we must get over the rancor that all major historical events leave in their wake. One of the bitterest ruptures to divide a society was that of the French Revolution. It destabilized the French state for an entire century, making it lurch from republic to empire to monarchy and back again. But by now, only cranks still commemorate the decapitation of Louis XVI. And on the evening of the 14th of July, Bastille Day, all the citizens of Paris happily waltz together, dancing in the city's various fire stations. And that, to my mind, is the best commemoration of all, to be happy and convivial together. I may on this occasion suggest to the President to identify a happy day for a recurring festivity, because it is not just trauma and high-minded seriousness that makes us a community, but also a bit of crack. Possibly Bloomsday could become an official national holiday. Possibly a new day could be instated, maybe the 16th of February. Why that day? It is in fact a day of glorious memory in Irish history. On that day in 1932, the Commonwealth government, having lost the general election, ceded power to the victorious Fianna Fáil Labour coalition. This peaceful democratic transition of power came less than 10 years after the bitter Civil War. It was, and here I follow Joe Lee's view, an act of astonishing political maturity in the fledgling new state. And this at a time when almost all of the new states of Europe were abandoning their hard-won parliamentary democracies and installing authoritarian strongmen and dictators, from Poland and the Baltic to Hungary, Greece, Germany, Austria, Italy, Spain, and Portugal. Ireland, in 1932, sensible and solid, was a shining exception. It had moved to a Hegelian Aufhebung of its decades of strife and struggle. It is still a lesson for the present when it comes to peaceful transitions of power. And that, too, is worth commemorating and celebrating. But what stays with us are the crises with their terrible beauty. What people remember are not gross national products or shifting demographics. They are the crises. Indeed, after a decade of centenaries, it seems as if the things we commemorate are the very opposites of celebrations, even though an independent and democratic Republic of Ireland eventually emerged from it all. That is my third point. What we remember in this contemporary, vibrant, successful, and modern Ireland still seems to gravitate towards the past as grievance. The bloody-mindedness of the black and tans, the denigration of snooty British aristocrats seems to blend with the tuberculosis and neglect in mid-century orphanages and with endemic misogyny and child abuse. And we haven't even started the centenaries of the Civil War period. Films like Neil Jordan's Michael Collins or Ken Loach's The Wind That Shakes the Barley have already epically recalled the animosities of that period and instilled them into the popular culture. And this may yet loom larger in public memory than the general election of 16 February 1932. In gravitating towards the commemoration of crises, Ireland is following a European pattern, but maybe that pattern should be reconsidered. And that's my fourth point. Long ago, all we commemorated was triumphs. It was what Nietzsche called the monumental view of history. This changed in the 20th century. People turned to a more critical view. We became sensitized to the fact that each heroic triumph has its collateral damage, its sacrifices, its victims. What used to be triumphalist monuments became sites of mourning. Under the Arc de Triomphe in Paris and elsewhere, the ashes of an unknown soldier were interred, and triumphalism became tinged with pity and remorse. Dublin from the beginning was part of this European shift from the triumphalist to the traumatic. It has its beautiful National War Memorial in Island Bridge, built in the final days of British imperial rule, and now, after many years of neglect, restored to its original dignity and beauty. This is not about triumph. It's not even about heroism. It's about something that is common to all men and women, irrespective of nationality, race, or creed: our mortality, our vulnerability. Empathy with those who faced their mortality and vulnerability in the crises of history. That is now the dominant mode of commemoration. The President built on that insight in his discourse today. And part of the ethics of commemoration is that it is fitting and necessary as a society to express and to foster that empathy. But I move to my fifth point, and that is this. Both in the mode of triumphalism and in the mode of pity or empathy, we tend to approach the past as a collective, and we divide the past in collectivities. When we celebrate our triumphs, we relive the moments when we faced our opponents, enemies, or a catastrophic crisis and got the better of them. And we see ourselves in what we might call epic terms. And when we mourn victims and save them from oblivion, we, for all our inclusivity, may still empathize with them for all their diversity in terms of their group identity. And while we avoid the ham-fisted mode of epic, we may overbalance instead into the sentimental mode of melodrama. In literary studies, we define melodrama as the type of narrative that relies on strong black and white contrasts between villains and victims. In melodrama, the victims are always innocent and virtuous, and they suffer at the hands of those who are motivated only by wickedness and depravity. This too is a black and white view of the world. It took a great and original thinker, the frequently mentioned Hannah Arendt, to make us see that pure evil is often banal rather than satanic, and takes the face of a dull civil servant rather than a diabolical monster. Neither epic nor melodrama can do justice to the complexities of the past. They schematize the world into two groups, and they schematize the ethics of commemoration into a group-based contrast: heroes against enemies or victims against villains. So what's the problem, you may ask? Well, here comes my point number 6. My colleague Iraklis Milas, an ethnic Greek from Istanbul, has done a classic experiment with Turkish and Greek respondents. As you know, Greeks and Turks belong to proverbially antagonistic nations, and Milas wanted to see where he could locate that antagonism. So he asked Greeks how they felt about Turks and how they felt about themselves, and similarly for the Turks. The responses were surprisingly even-handed and serene. Sure, there were good ones and bad ones amongst us as well as amongst them, and after all, the bottom line was that we were all humans and the others were not all that different. Milas wondered at this surprising lack of antagonism, and he probed further. He asked the Greeks not how they saw themselves or how they saw the Turks, but how they thought the Turks saw them. How do you Greeks think that the Turks think of you? And the analogous question to his Turkish respondents. How do you think the Greeks think of you Turks? The answers to these questions were indeed full of rancor, suspicion, and animosity. The others despise us. They do not recognize our civility and dignity as a modern and advanced nation. They begrudge us our independence. They think we are their enemies. They think we are their enemies. It was there that the enmity was found, at the level of imputation. What we think that they think. There is a very important lesson in this experiment. Group antagonism is at its most virulent and at its most intractable when it is in camouflage and when it is unacknowledged. We are not aware of it in ourselves and only suspect it to reside in the other. We see the other as we think they see us. We are rancorous without being aware of it, and we betray our rancor by pretending it is theirs rather than ours. This prejudice of how we think the others see us drains our confidence in each other's intentions, prevents us from expecting or showing generosity, and makes us lonesome and isolated in what we feel is an unreliable world. It's good and necessary to move away from simplistic celebrations of identity, to include and embrace the groups that have been silenced by history, and to emphasize the diversity of the past. But in order to fully achieve a Hegelian Aufhebung, we may need to go one step further, to acknowledge and uproot our rancor and move towards generosity. That is how I understand Ricoeur's notion of hospitality, as invoked by President Higgins. Whatever the past was, it was, as Professor Laffan pointed out, complex. It was not as ethically simple as our epic or sentimental commemorations imagine it, and too contradictory to be pigeonholed into groups. And this brings me to my seventh and final point. If we acknowledge not only the diversity of the past, but also the complexity of the past, we may be able to replace rancor by generosity. The harsh quandaries and the perplexity of the past were most poignantly and relatably experienced at the level of the human individual, facing the turbulent forces of history. Individuals face the challenge of having to make difficult choices. Collectives emerge from the choices that have already been made. That is why collectives are best visible from hindsight, to us who commemorate. But individuals, more than groups, can impress us with something that is neither epic nor melodramatic, but tragic and dignified, and in a Hegelian sense, uplifting. Nowadays, we are more aware of individual dignity in our commemorations, and Dolan has given very moving examples of this approach. We read out the names of victims, highlight them as relatable humans rather than as representatives of a group, people who hoped and feared and who had their own individual life to lead, facing difficult choices. In the Immigration Museum in Paris, migrants and refugees leave personal mementos with stories attached to them. These stories speak to us directly from human to human, and they enrich us. And that's the note I would like to conclude in. I would like to see the com taken out of memoration. I would like to see a polyphony of personal narratives telling us how complex things were for each one of them. It would be great to see commemorative platforms put in place of people who come to us with stories, as the poem says, that allow us to relate individually to individuals in all their human complexity, rather than reducing them to group identities. And I think this would be a noble task for a future-looking state. Thank you.
Jupil Larsen, thank you so much for your contribution from Amsterdam. We have circulated the papers to some few who might have been with us today had COVID not restricted the audience today. And we've invited comments from them. And let me now put some of the points and questions that they've suggested to our panel. All of us are still with us. Paul Johnston, the incoming British ambassador to Ireland, and the President said that to read history with respect for difference, but the incoming ambassador, Paul Johnston, asks us to consider the teaching of history in both our countries. Michael Laffan, as you're a long-time teacher of a third level, what is your opinion of how history is taught now and how it could be taught, perhaps improved, in our schools?
Well, I taught history for over 30 years, and in that time there were an enormous number of changes. syllabuses were altered every 5-10 years or so. There was, I'm afraid, in UCD at least, my own university, somewhat less of an emphasis on British history than had been the case in earlier years. There was concerned with Asia, with Africa, America, and so on. British history tended to become somewhat marginalised, and also, and this I see as a serious fault, British history was seen in the context of Ireland. Britain appeared only when it was doing something in Ireland, and not when, for example, the Industrial Revolution was taking place. So I think there is a need for an examination of British history quite independently of Ireland, to study it in its own right. And also, in reverse, I think Irish history can be seen as part of the history of the 4 countries that formed part of the United Kingdom, 3 of them still in the United Kingdom, or 3 and a bit, and that the new tendency towards United Kingdom history, including Ireland up to 1922, rather than English history, which dominated for so long, that is an important element. And I think there has been great progress, and I think there should be even more progress in the future.
And Dalton, what's your opinion of this? How we teach history here?
No, I'd share Michael's views on this, because, again, British history is something that is neglected, I think, in my institution too. I mean, I think it's certainly even within Irish history, when we look at Britain and Ireland, it's often very much from the Irish perspective, and even just getting students to look at something like the treaty, getting them to think of it from the perspective of British priorities. But I think more excitingly, our capacity to ask different questions of maybe familiar things is very clear, and our students have access to materials that I certainly didn't have when I was a student, and Michael taught me. The fact that they can sit at their computer and read Bureau of Military History statements, military service pensions, they can ask the complex questions, they can get to that level of the individual that I think you was talking about, and I think that's in a way central to asking and creating that kind of I suppose, narrative hospitality, really. And that's possible now in a way that I think it wasn't even 10 years ago, never mind 30 years ago.
Juppe Learson, do you have a view on this, how we teach history? I mean, your point about the Greeks and the Turks and how each saw the other was interesting to it, because I think that could be a parallel between Britain and Ireland too.
Absolutely, and it was intended as such. But I cannot presume to say anything about teaching curricula in Britain or Ireland, but what does strike me is that in the world at large now, we really have a great need for history to be actually taught. And we have to create space for that in our curricula at primary, secondary and tertiary level. Because more and more people get stories from the past that are, if I may call it like that, fake news. They get the epics, they get popcorn heroics, they get television serials. And sometimes we see history being falsified as it emerges, even in these last few months. So there needs to be some form of academic calibrated narrative. And also we need to teach people to think critically and to realize that whatever you can say about the past, there were also differences. And the most important thing that I would feel in response to the question is the modern state needs to fund and accommodate more teaching of history in its school curriculum.
President Higgins, what's your opinion on this and on its role at this centenary?
What I found very interesting, because it's something that wouldn't have happened some years ago, even just a few years ago, was that those contributing and responding to my paper were quoting E.P. Thompson. Now, I think there's a clue in that, and the clue is in relation to the common disability of the historiography in both the case of Ireland and our neighbouring communities is the neglect of class. Because this is very important. I very much agree with Mark Laffin when he speaks about, let us say, the Industrial Revolution and so on. What's striking is that how difficult it would have been, and maybe I'm projecting now, for people, let us say, who had joined the IRC, the people who were in the auxiliaries, to understand the class they came from. And this has always struck me as incredibly important. The big change that has taken place in history, I think, in both places, is in fact people have become more extensive. But if you take, let us say, the British history, it's absolutely festooned with symbolisms of a particular power expression. But actually to get the history of the mining communities and what happens, to get the history of the people who were in the early days of the commercial revolution, or the migrations that took place into the cities. That's quite weak. Thompson does that. With Thompson's Thompson's acceptance of Thompson's approach to history is late enough. Maybe I'm outside of history, but to me, I remember Thompson visiting Ireland and remember him speaking in Galway, but he wasn't regarded as mainstream then. But of course, he's a seminal figure. He's incredibly important. And the same thing is true in relation to Ireland, in a way. If after my paper and after the responses, people are at different levels of empowerment in having access to the kind of literacy in relation to historical events that I'm speaking about, and that has to be recognised. And in fact, not only are they somewhat excluded, but they actually can be preyed upon by, if you like, giving false versions of the past that actually stand in the way even of their own understanding and participation in the discourse.
Can I move on to, I want to bring in Kieran Benson on this. Dr. Johnston McMaster of the Irish School of Ecumenics, he says, as confessionalism has fostered division, should the churches publicly acknowledge their exclusionary and divisive role and set out their vision of a reconciling pluralist and shared Ireland?
I think that's a very interesting point. I mean, I'm somebody who grew up with no history education in my Christian Brothers school, and it was the sense of the world I got by osmosis rather than by instruction. And one of the things I learnt greatly was in college how profoundly important were the persistence of ideas in the construction of the sort of person I was. So when we come to the churches, in my experience, there was huge division. And the idea of the common conversation that came in 62, 63 with John Paul the 23rd was amazing. But then it seemed to die a bit.
But have they a role now? That's the question.
Yes, absolutely. There are new religions in here as well. I'm struck by the proportion of the Irish population that don't have any of this shared history. You know, they're new and they're bringing their own churches as well. So the divisiveness of churches would certainly be assisted by some superordinate commitment to this.
Yeah. You, Bill Larson, do you want to come in on that, on the role that the churches might take now, since they fostered division for so long?
Well, it depends what country you're looking at. Churches can play a very toxic role if their theology is aligned with the interest of the nation. They can also work in opposition. A church can be a very powerful mobilizer against a tyrannical regime. And it's always the prerogative of the powerful to tender apologies. It's a bit of a fashion these days. Now, as we heard today, if you want to have reconciliation, the importance of an apology lies in empowering the victim to give or withhold forgiveness. If it's just an apology as a press statement, you want to show some goodwill and see how you can actually do things differently in the future. That's all I have to say for that.
This brings up a point that Professor Peter Shurlow, the Director of Irish Studies at the University of Liverpool, made in response to the President's paper. He recalled his own mother's invariable response to violence during the Troubles in emphasising always the grief of, as she heard the radio in the morning, yet another mother, her grief at this latest death. And he says in that short sentence was a giant leap across the divide. His mother's words were in effect a commemorative act based upon a unity of grief. And he wants to ask us, how do we emphasise those acts of inter-community protection and build them more firmly into memory? President.
I think they're very important, and I think there's Anne Dolan's presentation, for example, opening with the powerful image of the coat, I think was incredibly important. But also, you see how connected it is to other kinds of exclusion. if the woman's experience has in fact been neglected, and if, as I emphasize again, there has been a very comprehensive exclusion of class as an approach in Irish historiography, and to some extent in British historiography too. It's recent enough. And what you're there for is that how could something as a very valuable expression of humanity and of being able to put oneself in the space of the other, it's connected to those two things, those exclusions of the woman's experience, the exclusion of class. And there's something I have to say as well about that, is that very often in the literature it's caught. If you look at the poetry, you will see, in fact, that the significance of these moments and of these gestures can be made central in a piece, that in fact actually the narrative that is in a formally presented way that attaches itself to the larger events misses entirely. This is one of the reasons, for example, in relation to something quite different, in relation to the migrant experience, that has been caught so perfectly in relation to literature of all kinds, but missed in the formal sociological accounts for a very, very long time.
And why do you think that would be?
I think it is the categories got frozen. This is again when I had in the paper mentioning about unfreezing moments in history and unfreezing forms and approaches, forms of method. You have to actually keep it fluid in a way to allow that which was previously neglected in, but also, of course, to avoid missing again what in fact you should have been noticing in terms of complexity. That's why complexity is not, in fact, actually a model that is closed. Complexity must be, and I think Kieran makes the point in relation to memory as well, that there is a constant openness required and the possibility of revision. I had a line of one of my own poems, and I said that the only thing of which I'm certain is the impossibility of certainties. And this price paid for certainties has been a very high one. And it's reflected ritually. It's been in relation to history as well, in both Great Britain and history here. The unwinding of these certainties will be a part of the whole exercise, I hope, and will be the better for it.
But that has happened, would you say that, and that has happened, say, if you compare the centenary of celebrations with what happened 50 years ago in the Golden Jubilee, the 50th anniversary of the Easter Rising, there's a huge change for the better, isn't there?
Yes, there is.
In terms of complexity.
Absolutely, and I think that there's a sense in which we're looking at different people and we're finding different people in the past, which that in a way that forces that change. It forces us away from the big names and the big events. And I think one of the things I've been most struck by, which in a way was part of the sources I was looking at in the context of my response to the paper, like much of the evidence I'm looking at are people identifying a dead person, a person who's died in this period. And they're often identified by the official or by the, by a policeman or by an army officer as, as a combatant, as a member of a particular battalion or whatever it might be. But then they're if you like, their next of kin comes into it and says, "That's my son. He was a carpenter. He was 28. He was, he had 2 children." Yeah. And in a way, I think we're coming at it now as very different historians too, in the sense that we're informed by things, as the President says, the history of class, but also things like the history of the family, the history of emotions, and gender. And we're thinking of people in these different ways. And I think one of the things that is really important, and I think it came through in the context of the centenary of the First World War. We saw a lot of people who had started to engage with genealogy at a very public level, and in a way that very basic steps of finding out about people in the past who were very close to you and very directly related to you, that they did what might seem like contradictory things. They could be lots of different categories that in a way doesn't fit any easy narrative, and I think that has actually changed and made people more receptive to this idea of dealing with complex people in the past who don't really fit the easy labels that we sometimes call them in the history books, and that makes this a little bit too straightforward.
Michael Lappin, on the 50th anniversary, indeed, a colleague of yours in UCD, the late Reverend Professor F.X. Martin, he talked about in a very celebrated article the national amnesia about those who, so many thought they were in the GPO in 1916, but you couldn't find people whose parents were in the RIC or whose families were in the Great War to the same extent, and yet the ratio was 16-1.
And very shortly before that 50th anniversary commemoration, Sean Lemass, as Taoiseach, made a famous speech in which he paid tribute to the Irish soldiers in the First World War. And this was a breakthrough, particularly from Fianna Fáil Taoiseach. It is quite remarkable. You mentioned F.X. Martin. In a volume that he edited at that time, Leaders and Men of the 1916 Rising, he included 2 chapters, one devoted to Edward Carson, another to James Craig, trying to bring in, even then in 1966, trying to bring in the Ulster Unionists into the story. So there were important things happening, opening up 50 years ago, and I think they should be remembered. It wasn't all bad back in 1966.
It still took studies 3 or 4 years until 1972, or in fact 7 or 8 years, to publish the article. Francis Shaw's
That's right, yes,
article
indeed.
Pierce.
Yes. That was deemed to be too sensitive at the time.
Yes. On one point, I really compliment you, Learson, on your 1932 point, that the losers in the Civil War would have taken power in another formulation, obviously, as Fianna Fáil, but effectively the losers, the De Valera-led losers of the Civil War, would take power. That, to a European view, strikes you, obviously, as a major point and achievement by both winners and losers, that there was a happy transition through the ballot box at that time.
Yes. Actually, you see that in a lot of the commemorations and narratives that I encounter in Central Europe, in Poland or in Hungary, people have a narrative that they got their liberty in 1918 and it was swept away by Hitler and Stalin in the late 30s. And what is elided from that is the fact that they voluntarily gave up their hard-won liberty to dictators type strongmen, Pilsudski in Poland and Horthy in Hungary, and that this turns out to be a bit of a pattern. And against that, Ireland really stands out. I mean, I didn't dream, it was Joe Lee who says this, and my mother-in-law who taught history in Dominican College also made that point. So I'm echoing greater historians than myself. But in the European frame, it really stands out as something that is totally admirable. So there is something in Irish politics, traumatic and disruptive as they were, that had a great inner resilience and something that also is worth commemorating.
I have to disagree with that to some extent.
President,
Our wonderful unanimity. I think the losers in 1932 were the people who had been excluded altogether, such as, for example, the people who formed the government in 1932 are from a very particular class. They have a particular record in relation to rejecting the treaty and then changing their mind and entering politics. But you must ask, what about the agricultural labourers? You must ask, what about all the working class people who were being represented by the trade union movement? And the consistent view of the people who are in the trade union movement and the labour movement right through north and south is that they try to find an alternative to the War of Independence. They make several attempts to end the Civil War. And then, in fact, when you want to make the very transition that is spoken about possible, they are the people who make it possible. But you also have something very interesting about who were the real losers. You get that actually through the 1930s. The 1930s is a horrific time, because here you find the excesses of denominationalism. You find the women who had participated in the War of Independence are canvassing against the Treaty of 1937, or the Constitution of 1937, which is so ignorant, really, of the position of women. And you have, at that time as well, 1932, you go on to 1934, and the new government then brings in in 1934, it will review the pensions legislation, and it continues to ignore it continues in a very divisive way. The 1930s in Ireland are a horrific time. You have the whole series of, you have the whole questions of censorship, you have the burning of the headquarters of some political parties in Dublin, you have sermons in relation to that are just really telling people that a priest should have the power to stick you to the ground if you weren't obedient. So I don't see it, quite frankly. I see the losers. The losers are, in fact, the social, those people who had hoped, look, okay now, we have the two combat, the two sides of what was originally a Sinn Féin version of something else, that they have come together to agree to hand over power. But outside of this, you had the housing issue, the unemployed issue, the people who were immigrating, all the issues in relation to sexuality and so on. They were the losers. So what you had was something, to me, excuse me from holding back my enthusiasm from seeing it as a great and glorious moment. I see it as just further failure.
Michael Laffin, on the question of the most oppressed people ever that you brought up, we did have a relatively easy time compared to Europe, didn't we, in our revolution?
We did. Of course, if you go back in history, 16th, 17th centuries, we see massacre on a grand scale, and Ireland's experience then was particularly terrible. But Ireland is sometimes in the 19th century described as a colony, and of course there were colonial elements in the British-Irish relationship, but no other colony sent members to the parliaments of the colonial power. And by the end, by 1918, Ireland was grossly overrepresented in London and Westminster. So, and of course, despite British negligence at the time of the famine, and nobody could do anything except criticise or deplore that, by and large, the British influence in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was very positive, and Ireland was doing quite well, against a terrible background, of course. So we got off much more lightly than, say, the Poles under Russians, Austrians, and Prussians, or Germans. Things weren't all that bad, which makes the revolution, in a way, quite surprising, that Ireland left the empire just at a time when Ireland had begun making a very grand profit out of belonging to the United Kingdom as a result of the social welfare legislation, old age pensions and so on mentioned earlier.
Yes.
In general, are you optimistic that we can, through the decade of centenaries and the commemorations and so on, that we can get through this with better relations between Ireland and Britain and between North and South, and that it can be a positive experience, and that the complexity of the story will be better understood?
I think so. My worry looking ahead to the next year or two is the Civil War, and whether discussions of atrocities on both sides will bring about the sort of hatreds that might destabilise a Fianna Fáil Fine Gael coalition. It might revive old hatreds. But in terms, your point, John, in terms of British-Irish relations, I think things will get better. And what is crucially important is that Irish people understand that Britain had its own legitimate interests at stake in, say, the treaty negotiations, in enforcing the treaty after it had been voted on by the Dáil and by Parliament in Westminster. This was quite legitimate from the British point of view. And if the Irish appreciate that, well, we are making one more step towards a better understanding between the Irish past and the British past.
Kieran, what's your view on
that? I was thinking about the question of history in schools and the fact that it seems to me it's a generalised thing, it's been diminished across the world. I was astonished years back to see in Australia it was going, and I see it here as well, and I know it's not compulsory in the way that it used to be. I think history is absolutely foundational, and I think peoples and individual people become what they are by virtue of a long timeline of events and ideas, and we need to be reminded of what they might be. And for myself, I remember when I went to college first, Father Shaw's article in 68, 69, that was astonishing to me. And then I didn't know what revisionism was. So the fact that you could have this osmotically arrived at idea of what Ireland was, changed by a controversy as a young person, was amazing. I'd love to see a much more interesting history in the schools.
And President, what's your view of the role that history is now playing through the commemorations? I mean, are you optimistic about?
Well, the most difficult point I had when I was involved putting together papers for the previous period from 1916 on, I've already said enough about class, but I had a real difficulty about getting attention to empire. And I do think we should have been looking at the context of what was happening in empires in the period, because it is very, very important. I do see a difficulty still that I haven't worked out, and that is the sense of place and the intimacies of place. What has happened, people have taken, and this is, I think all the local histories, and the local history movement is terribly important, but it is very important that they bring in, if you like, the small stories and the intimate stories, and to do it in a very general way. Because what has happened very often is that places and events have had embedded upon them, if you like, versions of history, which it is very, very difficult to change. There is very little revisionism possible in some of the places because people have, and the folk story has taken on a particular colour. Now, there's a huge difference between doing local history, in which it is really local and inclusive and drawing on everybody who was in the locality, and, for example, someone who has taken a grand narrative and imposed it on a place of stones or on a bog or on a field or something like that. That's difficult. And when we come on to the further seminars, I'm sure it's an issue I will try to deal with.
But love of place, love of one's own
Yes.
place is a very powerful sentiment and a positive one. For all
Oh,
sides.
absolutely. And this is another distinction again between the people, for example, in Parliament. And I refer in my paper to the long spectrum of Irish nationalism. I made reference, for example, to the trades and that of which my father was one. And I really think what I find it quite astonishing is the people looking at who were members, for example, of the volunteers. I would love to see a good study on how many first inheriting sons in the farms were members of the volunteers, and a huge overproportion of those who were working in shops, indentured people and so on, who took most of the risks. And when the new state forms, they are not the people who are in Dublin. They're not the people heading into the high offices of the state. So that long spectrum, in my case, is very class specific in relation to outcomes and very class specific in relation to what would become the policies of the independent state, be it in relation to clericalism, be it in relation to equality, be it in relation to the idea of the public world, and very particularly in relation to the role of women in society.
And these will be themes that you hope will be reflected in the next two seminars, isn't that
Oh
so?
yes, I think the important part of it is to have the scholarship in its richness and diversity, and how richer it is, and all the new people and people who are representing the neglected themes, and I'm hoping to make it as rich as I can. Yeah.
So you'll meet Professor Rowland's point about the fact that she was only one woman.
Oh
in
yes,
today's
and that would really
proceedings,
simply
yeah.
because, quite frankly, we had a specialist on memory, and we had other difficulties in COVID. But my intention has been, from the very, very, very beginning, is to have an equality of participation. And what I have to say as well is that some of the most significant writing I have been talking to, I quoted in my paper, are in fact from women historians, and we'll be hearing from them.
Yes. Well, before we finish on the questions, there are two from practicing historians. Not surprisingly, they are interested in archives, Diarmuid Ferreter and Katrina Crowe, and they're wondering, in one case, the military service pensions collection and the archives of industrial schools, Magdalen laundries, mother and baby homes. What challenges are posed by these archives in relation to remembrance and commemoration?
Well, I think as far as I'm concerned in relation to archives, they are important not only for the formal studies, but they're important for all of the people mentioned in them, affected by them, and the communities that they're taken from. And I believe very strongly that they must be, those that have been made accessible have been of enormous value. I think all of the others in relation to institutional archives, they should be opened up. And this is all part of, again, of the being able to deal with what happened in a mature and sophisticated way. I think that's essential. My own family's records are in the military, are in the pension records that you mentioned. And again, what I found there is that there's some more detail on my father and my uncles, but the position of my aunt, for example, who was brothers on each side of the Civil War, is that I was so struck really by the way that women were dismissed in particular in relation to the pension applications. Women of all classes, even widows of some of the principals and so forth, differentiations between how they were treated. Can you imagine when you had a situation where two widows, for example, would have their husbands are being remembered in different ways. But I think very particularly about people like my aunt, who was in Commemorations, and who simply said, how could I take a side when I had brothers on both sides? And bringing cigarettes to one lot before in prison and to another lot, going on with an ass and cart to actually seek to make representations on behalf of her brother who is in Tentown. These women, they might be regarded as women who didn't matter enormously in the scheme of things, but they're the people who carried the texture and the experience of both the War of Independence and also of the Civil War, and then what came after it in a way. And it's not a good story, but I'm not saying it for out of any bitterness. The time is to make sure that we make up for it. And that's why in course I would hope that you will find women participating, not just those, but in terms of their great strengths as well in all of the different areas.
So Anne Dolan, do you think that will be redressed in the coming years? I'm not saying just within this decade of centenaries, but future scholarship. Do you think there is an appetite there now for this story to be told?
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think the archives are central to that. The story can't be told without them. But equally, they can only be told. And I think we've led the way in this. It's very striking when you go, the archives here have been digitised, things like the census, the bureau, the pensions, they're being digitised, they're being made freely available to anyone who wants to look at them. That is not the case in the archives in the UK, for example. So I think we've done a huge amount of work there. There's a huge amount more to be done. And I think it's very important.
The records are there for it to be done.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we need to move a little bit beyond seeing the period maybe in sort of chunks of centenaries, if you like, because I think the important work that needs to be done is to see how things bleed out beyond 1922-23. And let's start thinking about, let's see the records of the Land Commission, because in a way that layered on top of the pensions let you see, if you like, the social history of 20th century Ireland for men, women, whoever. And I think it's only when we start to sort of get access to those types of records, we're actually facilitating. That's back to the points I think others have raised about the importance of history at all levels, at primary, secondary, third level, it does, across the board. It's, we're really facilitating people to ask the questions. We've moved past giving them finite, definite, divisive answers. What we want to do is equip them with the questions to ask of those materials and let them find the past in their own ways.
And ask their own questions.
Absolutely.
And interrogate the records the better to answer those very questions.
And they'll come up with questions we can't even think of at the moment as historians of the period.
I ask you, Yuppie Learson, finally, have you any comments to make on our discussions we've had here, looking at it through Dutch eyes?
No, it was very instructive, and I think commemorations and centenaries are a way of schematizing history in all European nation states, and the way this is being done here in Ireland is exemplary. What I like as a takeaway from the last bit is the importance of the archive, but also of, if you like, Irish orality, the stories. With the military archives, the personal narratives have become formative in refreshing historical views. And one would hope indeed that the archives and the public are no longer separated by the academic historians who write big books about them, but that they can become themselves a platform for commemoration and for popular memory, for public memory.
Thank you, Yuppie, very much for joining us from Amsterdam, and thanks also to our guests here who read papers and who've contributed to this discussion. I'm now going to call on the President, looking forward to the rest of these seminars, to finally address us.
May I most sincerely thank Professor Ciarán Benson of University College Dublin, Professor Anne Dolan of Trinity College Dublin, Professor Michael Laffin of University College Dublin, and Professor Joop Leersen of the University of Amsterdam for the profoundly thought-provoking and intellectually stimulating addresses they gave today. It was the first seminar of our centenary commemoration series, to which we've given the title Machnamh 100. I have to say that each presentation was a tour de force, shining a light on often under-researched and perhaps overlooked aspects of Ireland's War of Independence, and providing analysis and insights that were grounded in deep, methodical, scholarly research. I do want to thank Dr. John Bowman for so deftly chairing today's session, and my friend of so many years, Professor Garrod O'Tuig, who has been of great assistance to me and the staff here at Áras an Uachtaráin in his advisory role to the Machnamh 100 series. I do want to thank anybody who has helped in any way. And may I also thank those who engaged by posing questions and making our own reflections and making their reflections a matter for debate in their offerings. Today was the first of our series of seminars that will mark the centenary commemoration of the War of Independence, the Civil War and Partition. In these seminars, we will invite residents of this island and beyond to reflect with integrity, respectfully, and within a framework of a narrative of hospitality on this foundational and complex period of our history. It is also that Machnamh 100 will be, in addition, I hope, to being a forum for reflection, perhaps become an aid to moving forward together on a journey to the future, that it might too constitute an archival record of the thinking of today, while making a reflection on the past in preparation for the future. I'm grateful to Minister Catherine Martin and her department for supporting this initiative, and to RT, who are assisting us in bringing it to a wider public. It is also my intention that the proceedings, of course, including each of our papers, will be published. So may I draw your attention to the next seminar and invite you. We have scheduled it for late February 2021, and the second seminar will focus on the theme of empire, instincts, interests, power, and resistance. And may I say, we're so fortunate to have some of the finest scholars in the field of Irish history and historiography as confirmed speakers. I will announce full details of that event later this year, but among the topics to be considered will be an overview of the international order and the landscape of power that prevailed following the First World War, the fall and reforging of empires, and the particular status and perceived power of the British Empire, in particular, circa 1920. We will reflect on resistance to empire and to nationalism within Ireland, and the position of Ulster and of Ulster Unionism in the debate on identities and power, with the establishment of the independent Irish state in Northern Ireland being the outcomes of this debate. I hope that you can all join us again in February for what I'm sure will be another informative, constructive, and memorable seminar. Thank you all for engaging with us in your different ways, and I do hope you enjoy today's reflection. Mavhuikas Liviljag is Berbanacht, Slán.